The Mafia boss's wife insulted the pregnant black maid until she stood up to defend his child. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's begin the story. It was a lavish evening at the Valentino mansion, the golden chandeliers casting a warm glow over the marble floors. The rich scent of expensive perfume mixed with the aroma of freshly cooked gourmet meals filled the air as guests in elegant attire chatted among themselves. At the far end of the grand hall, a woman stood quietly, almost invisible in her crisp, black maid's uniform. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the silver tray she held, the weight of the silverware making her arm ache. This was a place where she had never truly belonged. Despite the opulence around her, she was only a servant. Her pregnancy, still in its early stages, was a secret to most, except for the woman who was now sneering at her from across the room. Elena, the wife of the Mafia boss, stood with her arms crossed, glaring at the maid with an expression that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Her high heels clicked sharply on the floor as she approached, her voice dripping with disdain. How long do you plan to stand there, maid? Shouldn't you be off somewhere taking care of your situation? She mocked, her eyes scanning the maid's belly. The room fell silent, as if everyone had collectively held their breath, waiting for the drama to unfold. The maid could feel the eyes of the other guests burn into her back, their judgment heavy in the air. Elena continued, her words sharp as a knife. Do you even know who the father is? Or is this just another one of your poor, desperate acts to cling to some illusion of a better life? The words stung like a slap, but the maid said nothing. She had learned to keep her head down, to endure in silence. She was just the help, after all. But something inside her shifted. The disrespect, the cruelty, it was too much to bear. And when Elena made a move to push past her, her arm brushing the maid's belly as if to make her feel smaller, something snapped. The maid straightened her back, her breathing steady despite the fear that rushed through her veins. She looked directly into Elena's eyes, her voice trembling but firm. I may be your maid, but I will not let you insult me or my child. The room was still. No one had expected such a bold response. Elena's face turned red with anger, but the maid stood her ground. Just as Elena opened her mouth to respond, a deep voice cut through the tension. That's enough. The Mafia boss had entered the room, his presence commanding everyone's attention. His dark eyes, sharp and intense, scanned the scene before him. Elena froze, her expression faltering for just a second. The maid's heart raced, but she kept her gaze fixed ahead. Without a word, the Mafia boss stepped forward, his gaze never leaving his wife. You've gone too far this time, Elena. Elena's mouth opened in protest, but her words died in her throat as he raised a hand, silencing her. Leave. Now, he ordered, his voice cold and final. The shock in the room was palpable. Elena stood there for a moment, her face a mask of disbelief, before turning on her heels and storming out of the room. The guests murmured among themselves, shocked by the turn of events. The maid, still standing in the same spot, felt the weight of the moment settle over her. She couldn't believe what had just happened. The Mafia boss, the man who controlled everything, had just defended her. He turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Are you all right? He asked, his voice unexpectedly gentle. The maid nodded, though she was still in shock. She didn't know how to respond, but she felt a wave of relief wash over her. For the first time in her life, someone had stood up for her, and it was the most unexpected person. The Mafia boss gave her a final glance, his eyes unreadable. Stay? I'll make sure nothing like this happens again. The words were simple, but they were enough to make her heart skip a beat. This wasn't just an act of kindness. It was a promise. She had no idea what the future would bring, but in that moment, she knew that everything had changed. The tension in the room didn't dissipate as easily as one might have expected. The faint sounds of murmurs and whispers continued to echo in the grand hall of the Valentino mansion. The guests were still processing the shock of what had just unfolded, the boldness of the maid's words, and the Mafia boss's unexpected intervention. As for the maid, she stood frozen in the same spot, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Her heart was racing, her thoughts tangled with the chaotic events she had just witnessed. She could still feel the heat of Elena's angry stare, the sting of the insults thrown her way, but now, as the Mafia boss stood before her, she felt something she had never felt before, an odd sense of security, a promise of protection. For the first time, she realized that she was not invisible, that her existence mattered to someone in this opulent house. The Mafia boss gave her one last glance before turning his attention to the other guests, who were still whispering among themselves. He raised his hand in a subtle gesture, silencing the room. "The matter is settled," he said, his voice firm but calm. "Let us return to the evening." The words were clear, authoritative. Yet, the weight of the moment lingered, and no one dared to challenge him. As the guests slowly returned to their conversations, the maid took a deep breath, still standing in the corner, uncertain about what was to come next. Would this moment change everything for her? Or was it just another fleeting act of kindness that would be forgotten in time? She couldn't help but wonder if her life would ever be the same. The Mafia boss had defended her, yes, but it was hard for her to believe it was more than a temporary reprieve. She had been humiliated in front of so many people, yet here he was, standing by her side. She wasn't sure how to feel about that. "You're dismissed for the night," the Mafia boss called out to her, his tone neutral. She blinked, surprised by the suddenness of the command. "Thank you, sir," she managed to say, her voice soft but sincere. He nodded curtly, acknowledging her gratitude before turning his attention to a nearby guest. The maid hesitated for a moment before turning to leave. As she made her way to the servants' quarters, she felt the eyes of the other staff members on her. They didn't speak, but she could sense their curiosity. Whispers of what had transpired in the grand hall were already circulating among them. She couldn't help but wonder what they thought of her now. Did they see her differently? Were they surprised that the Mafia boss had defended her? Did they think she had done something special to earn his protection? She wasn't sure what to think, but as she reached the small, dimly lit room she called her own, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. This was the first time in years that she felt seen, that she felt respected, but it was also the first time she felt truly vulnerable. The security that the Mafia boss had promised her seemed both reassuring and terrifying. She wasn't sure if she could trust it, if she could trust him. Would he keep his word, or was this all part of some bigger game? As she sat down on the edge of the bed, her thoughts were interrupted by the soft sound of a knock on the door. She stood quickly, her heart racing. Was it him? Had he come to check on her? But when she opened the door, it wasn't the Mafia boss. Instead, it was one of the other staff members, a young woman who worked in the kitchen. "The boss wants to see you," she said quietly, almost hesitantly. The maid's stomach dropped. She hadn't expected to see him again tonight. "What does he need?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "He didn't say," the young woman replied. "But he seemed serious." The maid nodded, a wave of unease sweeping over her. She had no idea what the Mafia boss wanted, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, it would change everything. As she walked through the halls of the mansion toward his private study, her thoughts were racing. What would he say to her? What was his plan? Was she truly safe? Or had she just been caught up in something far more dangerous than she could imagine? She wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew one thing. This was only the beginning. The maid walked through the long corridors of the mansion, her footsteps echoing off the marble floors as she made her way to the Mafia boss's private study. Her heart pounded in her chest, and with every step, the tension built. What did he want to talk to her about? After the events of the evening, she couldn't help but wonder if he had more to say about what happened with his wife. The possibility of being summoned to his private quarters felt surreal, even though she had been standing there in the same room only moments ago. She had never been in the private areas of the mansion before, and now she was about to meet with the most powerful man in the city. Her thoughts raced as she tried to calm her nerves. She could still feel the weight of his gaze from earlier, the way he had stood up for her without hesitation, without fear of what his wife might think. It was hard for her to wrap her mind around it. She had spent so many years being invisible, a mere presence in the background of the lives of others. But tonight, something had shifted. She wasn't just the maid anymore. As she approached the door to his study, she paused, taking a deep breath. She wasn't sure if she was ready for whatever was coming next, but she knew one thing. She had to face it. She knocked softly on the door, and a deep voice from within responded immediately. "Come in." The door swung open, and she stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with the soft glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the walls. The Mafia boss sat at his desk, his back to her, as he looked over some papers. His silhouette was sharp and commanding, the posture of a man who had built an empire. She hesitated for a moment before stepping further into the room, her shoes clicking against the polished wood. He didn't immediately acknowledge her presence, and for a moment, the silence stretched uncomfortably between them. Finally, he spoke, his voice calm, but with a hint of something she couldn't quite place. "Sit down." His words were not a command, but a quiet invitation. She did as he asked, carefully lowering herself into the chair across from his desk. The air between them was thick with unspoken tension. She could feel her heart racing, but she kept her gaze steady, not wanting to appear weak in front of him. He looked up from his papers and locked eyes with her, his expression unreadable. "You're wondering why I called you here," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, unable to find her voice. He sighed and leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the desk. "You did something tonight," he began, his gaze never leaving hers. "That surprised me. You stood up to Elena. That takes courage. Something I haven't seen in a long time." His words hit her like a wave, and for a brief moment, she felt a pang of disbelief. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge her actions so directly, and certainly not with such respect. "I've dealt with a lot of people over the years, but most would have stayed silent," he continued. "Most people would have been too afraid to confront her. But not you." She swallowed hard, trying to process what he was saying. "I didn't have a choice," she finally managed to say. "It was too much. I couldn't let her say those things, not about me, and especially not about my child." The Mafia boss's eyes softened just slightly, and for the first time, she saw something like approval in his gaze. He nodded slowly, as if considering her words. "You've been here for a long time, haven't you?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Years," she replied. "I've seen many things, but I've never felt like I mattered. Not like that." His gaze softened further, and he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the desk. "You matter now. You stood up for yourself, for your child. That's more than most people ever do." She wasn't sure how to respond to that. She had spent so much of her life blending into the background, never making waves, never drawing attention to herself. But now, here she was, in the presence of the man who had the power to change everything. "I've been watching you," he continued, his voice steady, yet intense. "You're more than just a maid. You're smart, strong, and you're capable of so much more than you realize." She felt a twinge of confusion mixed with a growing sense of discomfort. "What did he mean by that?" "I want to offer you something," he said, his eyes piercing into hers. "I know this is unexpected, but I think you've proven yourself worthy of more than just being part of the staff. I want you to work with me directly. No more cleaning. No more being invisible. I want you to be part of something bigger." His words hung in the air, and she felt her pulse quicken. Was this a joke? Was he testing her? She had spent years just trying to survive in the shadows, and now, he was offering her a chance to step into the light. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I mean, I'm offering you a position where you'll have influence, where you'll have power, where you won't be looked down upon anymore." She could hardly believe what she was hearing. "You want me to join your business?" she asked incredulously. He nodded slowly. "Not just any business. You'll be working with me personally. You'll be my eyes and ears, handling things that no one else can. And you'll be paid well, more than you've ever imagined." The room seemed to close in around her as she tried to process the enormity of what he was offering. She had always been just a maid, just a piece of furniture in the mansion. But now, the Mafia boss was offering her a seat at the table, offering her a role in the world she had never imagined herself being part of. "I can't," she began, but he interrupted her. "You can," he said firmly. "And you will." She didn't know what to say, or even what to feel. This was all happening so fast, and it felt like a dream. But as she looked at him, she realized that this was no fantasy. This was her reality now. The maid sat across from the Mafia boss, her mind still reeling from the offer he had made to her just moments before. She couldn't believe it. After years of being treated as nothing more than a shadow in the grand house, he was offering her a chance to step into the light. A position of power. A role where she would no longer be invisible. The words seemed too big, too out of reach. Could she really do this? Could she become something more than just a servant? Take your time, the Mafia boss said, breaking her out of her thoughts. I understand this is a lot to process. His tone was calm, patient, and yet there was a firmness in his words that left no room for doubt. He meant what he said. I don't know what to say, she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. This is so unexpected. The Mafia boss leaned back in his chair, studying her. I understand. But you've already shown that you're capable of more than what you've been doing. Standing up to Elena tonight was no small thing. Most people would have cowered. But you didn't. You protected yourself, and you protected your child. That's the kind of strength I need. His words echoed in her mind, but the doubt still lingered. She had spent her whole life feeling small, unnoticed. Could she really be someone who commanded respect, someone who stood by his side? But I don't have experience in this world, she said, trying to voice the fears that plagued her. I've spent my whole life cleaning and serving. I don't know anything about your business, about how it works. The Mafia boss raised an eyebrow, his expression thoughtful. You don't need to know everything. What I need is someone who is smart, someone who can think on their feet, someone who isn't afraid to act when the moment calls for it. You already have that. I can teach you the rest. She could hardly believe what she was hearing. He was offering her a chance to change her life completely, to be part of something she had never dreamed possible. But she hesitated. Why me? Why not someone who's already in your circle? Someone who knows how things work. The Mafia boss's eyes softened for a brief moment. Because you're different. You're not afraid to be real. I've worked with enough people to know when they're playing a part, when they're pretending to be something they're not. You're not like that. And that's rare. She looked down at her hands, the rough skin on her palms a constant reminder of the life she had always known. But now, in this moment, she wondered if she could let go of that life. Could she really step into a new world, one where she was valued, where her voice mattered? I won't pretend it. Will be easy, the Mafia boss continued, his voice steady. There will be risks. There will be times when you'll feel overwhelmed. But I promise you this. You will never have to face anything alone. I will protect you, and I will make sure you have the tools to succeed. The maid felt a shiver run down her spine. He was offering her more than just a job. He was offering her a future she had never imagined for herself. And yet, with that promise came a weight. She would be tied to him, to his world. She would no longer be invisible, but she would also no longer be free. What do you need from me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Mafia boss leaned forward, his gaze intense. I need your loyalty. I need you to trust me, to be willing to learn, and to never back down when things get tough. I need you to be part of my team. She swallowed hard, her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so long just surviving, just getting by. But now, for the first time, she had a choice. She could choose a life of safety, of protection, or she could choose the unknown, a world that was dangerous, yet filled with the promise of something more. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of the decision settle on her shoulders. She had always dreamed of a better life, of being more than just a maid, of being someone who mattered. Now, it seemed that dream was within reach. I accept, she said quietly, the words coming out more confidently than she had expected. I'll do whatever it takes. The Mafia boss's lips curled into a faint smile, the first real smile she had seen from him. Good, he said. You won't regret this. As he stood and walked to the door, he turned to her once more. You'll start tomorrow. Rest tonight, and be ready. The maid nodded, feeling a surge of determination rising within her. She had made her decision. She had taken the first step into a new life, and there was no turning back now. As she left the room, she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of anticipation. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had a chance to shape it. She would no longer be just the maid. She would be something more. The maid had never felt a moment so heavy with both fear and anticipation as she did that morning. She stood in front of the full-length mirror in the small servants' quarters, staring at her reflection, trying to comprehend the magnitude of the change that was about to unfold in her life. The clothes she wore were simple, just a plain black dress she had worn countless times before, but today, everything felt different. Today, she was no longer just a maid. Today, she was about to step into the world of the Mafia boss, to leave behind the life she had known and embrace something completely unknown. It was a terrifying thought, but also exhilarating. The offer he had made her last night was still fresh in her mind. He had given her the chance to rise above her station, to work alongside him in a role she could never have imagined. But as much as she wanted to believe in the promise of a better life, doubts lingered. What would it be like to work for him? To be a part of his world? Would she lose herself in it, just as she had felt invisible for so many years? The sound of a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. It was a young woman from the kitchen, one of the staff who had been with the family for a long time. "The boss is waiting for you," the woman said with a soft smile, though her eyes held a glimmer of curiosity. "You're not just a maid anymore, are you?" The maid didn't respond immediately, the words caught in her throat. The idea that others were already noticing the change in her felt surreal. But she nodded, swallowing her uncertainty, and followed the young woman down the narrow hallways toward the Mafia boss's private office. As she walked, her thoughts raced. She had been given a chance that most people could only dream of, and yet, a part of her felt like she was stepping into a world she would never be able to escape from. Would she become part of the life of crime and power that the Mafia boss controlled? Or was there more to him than she had seen so far? When they reached the door to the study, the young woman gave her a reassuring look before knocking. "Come in," came the deep voice from inside. She took a deep breath and stepped into the room. The Mafia boss was seated at his desk, his back turned to her as he looked over papers. The room was dim, with only the soft light of a lamp illuminating the dark wood of the desk. He did not immediately acknowledge her presence, but she knew he was aware of her. She could feel his presence in the room, in every inch of the space. His power, his control, it was palpable. "You're here," he said without turning around, his voice smooth and calm. "Sit down." The maid obeyed, lowering herself into the chair across from his desk. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her nerves still on edge, but she kept her back straight, trying to appear composed. The Mafia boss finally turned his chair to face her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "I've been thinking about what we discussed last night," he said, his gaze piercing. "And I've decided that today we begin." His words were not a question, but a statement. She felt a rush of nerves flood her chest, but she nodded. "I'm ready." He gave her a small smile, one that seemed to hold a secret she couldn't quite decipher. "Good. I know you're nervous, but I need you to trust me. This is going to be a learning process. You'll have to prove yourself, but I'm confident you'll adapt quickly." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts in her mind. The Mafia boss stood and walked over to a cabinet, retrieving a small envelope from inside. He placed it on the desk in front of her. "This is your first assignment," he said, his tone businesslike now. "You will take this envelope to a contact of mine. He's expecting you. He's someone I trust, but he needs to know that you're capable." She reached for the envelope, her fingers brushing against the cool paper. It felt heavier than she had expected. "What's in it?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "You'll find out when you meet him," he replied. "But you must be discreet. This is about trust. Do you understand?" She nodded quickly, her heart pounding. "I understand." The Mafia boss paused for a moment, studying her, as if weighing her response. "Good. Now go. And remember, this is just the beginning. I'm counting on you." With those words, she stood up, the weight of the envelope in her hands suddenly feeling real, its significance clear. This was the first step in her new life, and it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. As she walked out of the room, she felt the eyes of the staff on her, the whispers already starting. She was no longer just a maid. She was someone important, someone who had been chosen for something greater. But as she made her way toward the front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that the world she was about to step into was much darker and more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Would she be able to navigate it? Or would she become a pawn in a game she couldn't control? She had no answers, only the certainty that her life would never be the same. The maid clutched the envelope tightly in her hands as she walked through the ornate front doors of the mansion. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the weight of the task ahead pressing down on her. She had never been given an assignment like this before. The Mafia boss's words echoed in her mind. This is about trust. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had no idea what was inside the envelope or what her first real task would entail, but she had to follow through. As she stepped out into the crisp morning air, she felt a strange sense of freedom mixed with unease. She had crossed a line now. There was no going back. The life she had known, the life of cleaning and serving, was slipping away. In its place was something unfamiliar, something dangerous. The streets of the city were bustling with activity as she made her way through the neighborhood, the weight of the envelope in her hand seeming to grow heavier with every step. She had been to this part of town before, but never on a mission like this. She turned the corner and found herself standing in front of an old building. It looked run down, its windows boarded up, its bricks weathered and cracked. This was the place. The Mafia boss had said his contact was expecting her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something she didn't fully understand. She paused for a moment, trying to calm her nerves, then walked up the stairs and knocked on the door. It was silent for a moment, and then she heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the other side. The door swung open, and a man with a stern face and sharp eyes greeted her. "You must be the one the boss sent," he said, his voice low and steady. "Come in." She stepped inside, her pulse quickening as she looked around. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes and the faint sound of classical music playing in the background. The man closed the door behind her, and she could feel his eyes on her as he sized her up. "What's in the envelope?" he asked, his gaze narrowing. "I don't know," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "The boss told me to bring it to you." He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step forward and reached out to take the envelope from her hands. His fingers brushed against hers, sending a shiver down her spine. He opened it slowly, pulling out a piece of paper and reading it in silence. She could feel her heart beating in her throat, wondering what the Mafia boss had sent him. The man didn't speak for a long moment, his face unreadable. Finally, he looked up at her. "You've been chosen, haven't you?" he said, his voice almost a whisper. "Chosen for what?" she asked, the uncertainty in her voice now giving way to confusion. The man let out a soft chuckle, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite place. "You don't know, do you?" he asked. "You're more than just a maid now. You've been brought into something bigger. You're in the boss's world now. And in this world, trust is everything." She was silent for a moment, trying to make sense of his words. This wasn't just about a job anymore. This was about something much more complicated, something much more dangerous. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice steady as she tried to keep the fear from showing. The man's eyes softened slightly, but only for a moment. "You'll find out soon enough. The boss is setting things in motion. He wants to see if you're ready for what's coming." He stepped aside and gestured for her to follow him. "Come on. The boss will want to speak to you again." She followed him through the building, her mind racing with questions. She had no idea what she had gotten herself into, but there was no turning back now. The Mafia boss had given her a chance to change her life, but at what cost? As they walked deeper into the building, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into a world where nothing was as it seemed, and every decision could cost her everything. They reached a door at the end of the hallway, and the man knocked twice before opening it. Inside, the Mafia boss was sitting at a large desk, his back to her, his fingers drumming idly on the surface. He turned slowly when he heard the door open, his gaze locking with hers. "You've made it," he said, his voice calm and composed. "I trust everything went smoothly?" She nodded, unsure of how to respond. "Good," he said, standing up from the desk. "I've got a new assignment for you. This will be your first real test. Are you ready?" She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes," she said, the word coming out more confidently than she had expected. "Good," the Mafia boss replied, his eyes gleaming with approval. "Then let's begin." The maid's pulse raced as she stood in front of the Mafia boss, her mind still reeling from the events of the past few days. The Mafia boss had kept his word, and now, she was here, facing a new reality, one that was far more dangerous, far more complicated than anything she had known before. She had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. His words from the night before echoed in her mind. Trust is everything. She wasn't sure if she could trust him completely yet, but she had no choice but to try. She had no idea what was coming next, but the atmosphere in the room was thick with expectation. The boss stood in front of her now, his presence commanding every inch of the space. His dark eyes scanned her, as though trying to read her every thought. You're here because I believe you can handle what's coming, he said in a calm, steady voice. His tone was businesslike, but there was a weight behind his words that made her stomach tighten. But it's not going to be easy. The world you're entering is dangerous, and you'll need to prove yourself. If you can't handle it, I won't hesitate to send you back to where you came from. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but nodded. I understand, she replied, her voice steady despite the anxiety creeping up on her. He looked at her for a moment, then turned to a drawer on his desk, retrieving a thick file and handing it to her. This is your first assignment, he said, his gaze never leaving her face. You'll need to deliver this to a contact of mine. They're expecting you. I've arranged everything, but I want you to make sure it's done properly. No mistakes. She took the file, the weight of it feeling like a physical burden in her hands. Who is this contact? She asked, trying to keep her voice calm. What do I need to know? The Mafia boss's eyes darkened slightly. His name is Marco, he said, his voice low. He's one of my trusted men, but we've been having some issues with him. I need to know if he's still loyal, if he's still trustworthy. You'll be testing him, in a way. Make sure he's still on our side. The words sent a chill down her spine. Testing loyalty? She didn't know how she felt about that, but she knew better than to question him. What if he's not? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. What if he's turned on you? The Mafia boss's expression hardened. Then you'll do what needs to be done, he said. I trust you to handle it. Don't worry about anything else. Just focus on the job. She nodded, though inside she felt the first stirrings of fear. She had no idea what would happen when she met Marco. Was he really loyal? Or was this just a trap? When do I leave? She asked, trying to steady herself. Tonight, he replied. You'll meet him at the usual place. I'll make sure you have everything you need. He paused, his gaze softening slightly. And remember, this is just the beginning. If you succeed, there will be more. If you fail, you'll regret it. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, but she didn't show it. She couldn't afford to show weakness. Not now. I'll do it, she said firmly, her voice stronger than she felt. The Mafia boss nodded. Good. Go prepare yourself. And don't let me down. As she left his study, the weight of the assignment pressed on her shoulders. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had always been just the maid, invisible, quiet. But now, she was being asked to prove her loyalty, to test another person's trustworthiness. The tension in her body was palpable as she made her way back to her quarters. The room felt colder now, the silence heavier. She wasn't sure what to expect when she met Marco, but she knew that her life was changing in ways she couldn't control. She spent the next few hours preparing herself mentally for the night ahead. Her heart was pounding in her chest as she dressed in something less formal, more suitable for the meeting. The night was dark, the streets of the city unfamiliar to her as she walked toward the location the Mafia boss had given her. It was a small, run-down bar on the outskirts of town, far from the luxurious mansion she had spent so many years in. She arrived early, standing outside for a moment, her nerves beginning to get the best of her. This was it, the moment when everything could change, when she could either prove herself or fail. She took a deep breath, walked into the bar, and scanned the room. There, at the back, she saw him. Marco. He was sitting alone, his face partially obscured by the shadows. As she approached, his eyes locked onto hers, and he gave her a small nod. You're here, he said, his voice calm but carrying an air of suspicion. I assume you've got what I need. She reached into her bag and pulled out the file, handing it to him without a word. He took it slowly, eyeing her for a moment before opening it. This is it, then, he said, his eyes scanning the contents. This is what I've been waiting for. She nodded, her hands clenched at her sides. The room seemed to close in around her as she watched him, waiting for a reaction. Would he accept it? Or was this the moment when everything fell apart? Marco's gaze flicked back up to hers, his expression unreadable. You know, the boss doesn't trust easily, he said quietly. But you've been chosen. That means something. The words were simple, but they sent a shiver down her spine. She had been chosen. But for what? And by whom? The tension in the bar was palpable as the maid stood silently across from Marco. She had handed over the file, and now, all she could do was wait. Her heart raced as she watched Marco closely, his eyes scanning the documents in front of him. The moment felt like an eternity, her thoughts spiraling with the weight of what had just transpired. The Mafia boss had trusted her with this task. She had done what he asked, but she had no idea what would happen next. The room was dimly lit, the flickering neon light from outside casting long shadows against the peeling walls. She could hear the low murmur of conversations from the other side of the bar, but it all felt distant, irrelevant. All that mattered was Marco's next move. He finished reading the file, then slowly closed it, setting it down on the table. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, and the maid could feel her breath catch in her throat. Marco's eyes narrowed slightly. "You don't know what this means, do you?" he asked, his voice calm, but laced with an undercurrent of something darker. She shook her head, confusion clouding her mind. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice betraying her uncertainty. Marco leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "You've been chosen, yes. But it's not just about delivering a file. It's about proving your loyalty, your ability to handle things when they get messy. And trust me, they will get messy." The maid swallowed, her nerves tingling. She had been prepared for a difficult task, but this was more than she had anticipated. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marco studied her for a long moment, his expression hardening. "The boss wants to see if you're worth this position," he said. "This isn't a game. He's testing you. You need to prove you're capable of dealing with the darkness that comes with the territory." Her stomach tightened as she processed his words. She had always known that the Mafia boss's world was dangerous, but hearing it from someone like Marco, who clearly had experience in this life, made it feel real, much more real than she had ever imagined. Marco stood up suddenly, making the maid flinch slightly. He picked up the file and slipped it into his jacket, then turned to face her. "You're not just a messenger anymore. You've crossed the line. The boss sees something in you. But now it's up to you to show him it wasn't a mistake." She stood there, frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say. Marco's words were clear, but they only raised more questions. What did he mean by prove herself? And what would it take to convince the Mafia boss that she was ready for what lay ahead? "You're going to meet someone," Marco continued, his tone colder now. "This is the next step. Do what needs to be done, and you'll earn the boss's trust. Fail, and you'll regret it." The maid nodded, her thoughts swirling as she followed Marco's lead. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm of questions in her mind. Marco didn't answer immediately. He simply gestured for her to follow him out of the bar. As they stepped into the street, the chill of the night air hit her, but the anxiety gnawing at her insides was far worse than the cold. Marco led her down a dark alley, the sound of their footsteps echoing off the brick walls. She couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. Everything was happening so fast, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for any of it. They reached an old, run-down building at the end of the alley. Marco turned to her, his face now serious, almost grim. "You'll go inside. The man you're meeting is named Victor. He's one of our associates, but he's been difficult. The boss wants to know where his loyalty lies. Make sure you get the truth." She nodded again, her throat dry. "How do I know if he's telling the truth?" she asked, a flicker of doubt creeping into her mind. Marco's lips twisted into a small, knowing smile. "You'll know. Trust your instincts. And if you need to, do whatever it takes to get the information." The words hung in the air, the implication clear. The Mafia boss's world was not a place for hesitation, for second-guessing. It was a world where power and loyalty were everything, and where weakness could cost you everything. With one last look, Marco turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her standing in front of the building, alone. The maid took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. She didn't know what kind of man Victor was, but she knew one thing. She had to be strong, and she had to prove she was worthy of the position the Mafia boss had offered her. She pushed open the door and stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. This was her moment. She had no idea what lay ahead, but she couldn't afford to back down now. The future was uncertain, but she was determined to face it head-on, no matter the cost. The maid stepped into the dimly lit building, the door creaking softly behind her as she entered. The cold air from the alleyway still clung to her skin, but the weight of her mission felt far heavier. She wasn't sure what to expect from Victor, but she knew this was a test, a crucial moment that would determine how far she could go in the world the Mafia boss had invited her into. The interior of the building was just as bleak as the outside. Dust motes floated in the air, caught in the faint light filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The place smelled musty, the kind of smell that came from long-abandoned buildings that had once seen life, but now lay forgotten. She could hear the faint sounds of someone moving inside, the shuffle of footsteps echoing through the empty hallway. She took a deep breath and moved forward, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. At the end of the hall, a door was slightly ajar, and she could see a man sitting at a table inside. His back was turned to her, but there was no mistaking the air of confidence that surrounded him. This was Victor. She approached the door and knocked lightly, her hand shaking just slightly. The man didn't move at first, but after a long pause, he spoke, his voice low and rough. "Come in." She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The man looked up at her with sharp eyes, his gaze piercing. He was in his early 40s, his face rugged with a 5 o'clock shadow, and an air of authority that made her instinctively straighten her back. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a cold, calculating look that seemed to measure her. "You're the one they sent, huh?" he said, his voice laced with disdain. "I expected someone else, but I guess you'll do." His tone was dismissive, and it irritated her, but she didn't show it. "I'm here to deliver a message," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the unease that crept up her spine. He raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "A message, huh? And what kind of message is that?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down. Let's see what you've got." She hesitated for a moment, then took the seat he offered. She placed the file carefully on the table between them. He eyed it for a moment before reaching for it, flipping it open with a slow, deliberate motion. "You're not from the family, are you?" he asked, his eyes flicking back to hers as he read the contents. "No," she answered truthfully. "I work for the boss." Victor snorted, clearly unimpressed. "The boss, huh? A real big shot, that one. What does he think you're gonna do for me?" She didn't answer right away. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. The Mafia boss had given her clear instructions, but she didn't know how much to reveal to someone like Victor. "I'm here to make sure you're still loyal," she finally said, her voice unwavering. Victor's eyes locked onto hers, his expression darkening. He closed the file and tossed it aside, leaning forward slightly. "You think I need to prove my loyalty to anyone?" he asked, his voice rising slightly. "I've been loyal to the boss for longer than you've been breathing, kid. Don't think you can come in here and tell me how to do things." The sudden hostility in his voice took her by surprise, but she didn't flinch. She had been trained not to show weakness, not to back down in the face of confrontation. "I'm not here to tell you how to do anything," she said calmly. "I'm here to make sure you're still on the boss's side. That's all." Victor stared at her for a long moment, his gaze unwavering. Then, with a slight chuckle, he leaned back in his chair. "You're playing a dangerous game, girl," he said. "You don't even know what you're walking into. You don't know the kind of man the boss really is." Her stomach tightened at his words, but she refused to show any fear. "I know enough," she said. "I've seen enough to understand how things work around here." He chuckled again, though there was no humor in it. "You think you understand?" he asked. "The boss is a man of power, sure, but he doesn't play fair. He's got enemies everywhere. And you? You're just a pawn in this game." She felt a chill run down her spine, but she stayed focused, not letting his words break her resolve. "I'm not a pawn," she said firmly. "I'm here because I was chosen. The boss trusts me." Victor's smile faltered for a moment, and for the first time, she saw something like respect flicker in his eyes. "Trust, huh?" he muttered. "Well, if the boss trusts you, maybe you'll make it after all." He leaned forward again, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "But you've got to understand something. This world, it's not for the weak. It's not for people who hesitate. If you want to survive, you've got to be ruthless. You've got to do whatever it takes to get the job done. And that means making hard choices." She nodded slowly, taking in his words. She wasn't here for the easy way out. She had made her choice, and there was no going back now. "I'm ready," she said quietly. Victor stared at her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Good," he said, his voice colder than before. "Then prove it." The weight of Victor's words hung heavy in the air as the maid sat across from him. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but the way he spoke about the ruthless nature of this world sent a chill down her spine. He was right, she knew. She was no longer just the maid, the invisible servant who cleaned and served the family. She had crossed a line, and now there was no going back. Victor's eyes locked onto hers, his expression hardening once again. "I'm not here to coddle you," he said, his voice low and serious. "You've got potential, but potential means nothing if you don't have the stomach to survive in this game." His words were blunt, no sugarcoating, just the hard truth. She nodded, trying to keep her composure. She wasn't sure if he was trying to intimidate her or challenge her, but either way, she wasn't going to back down. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves twisting in her gut. Victor leaned back in his chair, studying her for a long moment. "You'll need to get yourself ready," he said finally. "The boss has big plans, and he expects results. But in this world, results aren't given. They're taken." The maid swallowed, her mind racing. What was she supposed to do now? What kind of results was he talking about? She knew the Mafia boss was powerful, but she had no idea how deep the web of power and influence stretched. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Victor's gaze softened for a moment, but there was still that calculating edge behind his eyes. "You're going to meet someone," he said. "A contact of the boss's. He's been involved in some shady business, but we need him. You're going to find out what you can, and if it's worth keeping him around, then we move forward. If not..." He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished. "And how do I do that?" she asked, her heart racing. "Do what needs to be done," Victor replied coldly. "If he's loyal, he'll come through. If not, you know what to do." She felt a shiver run down her spine. The words sounded like a threat, but she had no choice but to follow through. "Where do I find him?" she asked. Victor pushed a piece of paper across the table. "Here," he said. "This is where you'll meet him. He's expecting you." She picked up the paper, glancing at the address written on it. It was a nondescript part of the city, an industrial area far from the luxury of the mansion. "Go there. Don't waste time. The boss doesn't like to be kept waiting." His tone was final, and she knew this was not a request. She had been given a task, and she had to complete it, no matter what it entailed. As she stood to leave, Victor's voice stopped her. "One last thing," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "You've got to understand that trust is everything in this world. You're being watched. Every move you make, every word you say. If you step out of line, if you make a mistake, it'll be your last." His words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had known the stakes were high, but hearing it from him, in such cold, direct terms, made it feel all too real. She nodded, trying to steady her breathing. "I won't let you down," she said quietly. "Good," he said, his lips curling into a small smile. "Now go. Don't waste any more time." The maid left the bar, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She had never felt so out of place in her life. The streets were unfamiliar, and the weight of the mission on her shoulders seemed almost unbearable. She had crossed a line, and now there was no turning back. The city around her seemed darker, more dangerous, as she walked to the address Victor had given her. The night air was cold, and she could hear the faint hum of the city's nightlife in the distance, but it felt like a world away. Her thoughts were racing. Who was this contact? What kind of person would she be meeting? And how would she handle whatever came next? She arrived at the industrial area, the buildings looming like silent sentinels in the night. The place was deserted, except for a few cars parked in the distance. She could feel her heart pounding as she approached the address on the paper. A man stood by the door of one of the buildings, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed. He didn't seem surprised to see her, but his eyes assessed her with an intensity that made her nervous. "You're the one sent by the boss?" he asked, his voice gruff. She nodded, her nerves tightening in her chest. "I have something for you," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. The man straightened up, his gaze never leaving her. "Come inside," he said, stepping aside to let her pass. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing. She had no idea who this man was, or what he wanted, but she had no choice. She had a job to do. She stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing through the empty building. The door slammed shut behind her, the sudden noise echoing through the empty building. The maid's heart raced as she took a step forward into the dimly lit room. The man who had opened the door stepped aside, allowing her to enter fully. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust, the silence oppressive. She could hear nothing but the sound of her own breathing and the quiet shuffle of the man's shoes as he moved behind her. She didn't turn around, keeping her back straight as she took in the surroundings. The building was old, its walls stained with time, its windows grimy and cracked. It was a far cry from the polished, luxurious mansion she had once called home. There was something unsettling about the place, something that made her feel like an intruder in a world she didn't belong to. "You're the boss's girl, right?" The man's voice broke through her thoughts. It was rough, with an edge to it that suggested he wasn't someone to be trifled with. She nodded without speaking, the words catching in her throat. She wasn't sure if she was supposed to say something, but she kept quiet. "I'm here to see you about the boss," she said, her voice steady despite the unease that twisted in her stomach. The man looked at her for a long moment before turning to a table on the far side of the room. He didn't respond immediately, but walked over to it and picked up a piece of paper. His movements were slow and deliberate, as if he was weighing every action. "I know who you are," he said finally, his voice low. "The boss wants to see if you're useful. He doesn't waste his time on people who can't prove themselves." The maid's heart skipped a beat. She had already been through so much, and now she was being tested again. She had no idea what was coming, but she couldn't afford to fail. "I can handle it," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The man glanced over his shoulder, giving her a scrutinizing look. "We'll see," he muttered. "But first, you're gonna prove it. We don't trust easily around here." He walked toward her, holding out the paper. "You're gonna take this to a contact of mine. Tell him what I need. Make sure it's done. If it's not, I'll know." His words were cold and direct, leaving no room for argument. She took the paper from him, her fingers brushing against his for a brief second. His touch was firm, commanding, and she couldn't help but feel a chill run down her spine. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave her a look that could freeze someone in their tracks. "Does it matter?" he asked. "You'll do what you're told. Take it, and don't come back without the right answers. Or else." The threat was unspoken, but clear. The maid nodded, her stomach churning. "I understand," she replied, keeping her voice calm despite the fear that bubbled up inside her. The man didn't say another word. He turned back to the table, his back to her, dismissing her in a way that made her feel small, insignificant. She stood there for a moment longer, feeling the weight of his silence press down on her, before finally turning toward the door. She wasn't sure what to expect when she met the contact, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing was easy in this world, and the more she stepped into it, the more she realized how far and over her head she was. As she stepped outside into the night, the air seemed colder, the world darker. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. She had already proven herself to the boss in some ways, but this was different. This was about loyalty, about trust. If she failed now, it could mean the end of everything. She had no choice but to follow through. She glanced down at the piece of paper in her hand, the name and address of the contact written neatly on it. She wasn't sure if she could trust anyone in this world, but if she wanted to survive, she would have to play the game. And to do that, she had to keep moving forward. She made her way through the streets, her eyes scanning the area as she walked. She didn't know what kind of person this contact was, but she knew. One thing for sure, it was either going to make her or break her. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, but she pushed it aside. She couldn't afford to think too much about it. She had to stay focused. She had to prove she was ready for whatever came next. When she finally reached the address, she stopped in front of a rundown building, the door slightly ajar. The place was far from inviting, but it was where she had to go. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest. A man stood by the counter, his back to her. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and the moment he turned around, she could feel the weight of his gaze. He was assessing her, just as Victor had done. She didn't say anything at first, waiting for him to speak. "You're the one sent by Victor," he said, his voice gravelly. "I've been expecting you." She nodded, the paper clenched in her hand. "I have a message for you," she said, her voice steady. "From the boss." The man looked at her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable, before gesturing for her to sit. She took a seat at the small, weathered table, her hands still gripping the piece of paper Victor had given her. Her heart was hammering in her chest, her thoughts spinning, but she forced herself to remain calm. This wasn't the time for fear, it was the time for action. The man sat down opposite her, his eyes not leaving her face. "So, you've come from Victor, huh?" he said, his voice low and rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. "And what does the boss want with me?" She handed him the paper without a word, watching him closely as he took it. He glanced at it quickly, his eyes flicking back up to hers with a sharp, calculating look. "Seems straightforward enough," he muttered. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "So what happens now?" She hesitated for a moment, unsure of how much she was supposed to say. The boss hadn't given her much direction beyond the delivery of the message. "The boss wants to know where your loyalties lie," she said, keeping her voice steady. "He wants to know if you're still on his side." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and she could feel the tension in the room shift. "Loyalties, huh?" he said, almost to himself. "And what if I'm not?" She felt a cold rush of fear sweep over her, but she didn't let it show. She had to stay focused, had to see this through. "Then I guess you won't be part of the boss's plans anymore," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And that would be a mistake, wouldn't it?" He was silent for a moment, as if considering her words. The silence between them felt thick, heavy. She could feel his gaze on her, probing, assessing. Finally, he spoke. "You know, I'm not one to take orders from just anyone," he said slowly. "I've been in this game a long time. I don't trust easily." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "So, you're going to have to prove that you're worth trusting." Her mind raced. Prove it? She wasn't sure how she could prove herself in this world, but she knew that the boss had trusted her, and she couldn't afford to fail now. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. The man smirked slightly, as if pleased by her response. "There's a meeting tonight," he said, pulling out a crumpled piece of paper from his jacket pocket and sliding it toward her. "You'll be there. You'll hear what's being said. And if it's something worth keeping, you'll bring the information back to me. If not, well..." He let the sentence trail off, the implication clear. "And what if something goes wrong?" she asked, her throat dry. He smiled, but it was a cold, cruel smile. "That's when you really prove yourself. You handle it however you see fit. The boss will respect that." She felt a surge of determination, mixed with fear. This was the moment that would define her place in the Mafia boss's world. There would be no more hiding in the shadows, no more playing the part of the invisible maid. This was the world she had chosen, and now she had to prove she belonged. She nodded slowly, taking the paper he offered her. "I'll do it," she said, her voice firm. "Good," he replied. "Then go. And don't disappoint me." She stood, the weight of the assignment settling on her shoulders like a burden she could not shake. The man didn't speak again as she turned to leave, his eyes following her every move. She stepped back into the cold night, the paper clenched in her hand, and her heart racing as she made her way to the meeting. The streets seemed emptier now, the shadows longer, as if the city itself was holding its breath. She walked faster, her footsteps quick and steady, the air around her feeling heavier with each step. This was the moment that could change everything. She didn't know what to expect when she arrived at the meeting, but she knew that she couldn't afford to make a mistake. Not now. Not when she was so close to everything she had ever wanted. As she reached the location marked on the paper, she paused, taking a deep breath. The building in front of her was small, nondescript, hidden in a quiet part of the city. She glanced around, making sure no one was watching, before slipping inside. The room was dark, but there was a faint light coming from the back. She moved toward it, her senses alert, every muscle in her body tense. The sound of voices reached her ears as she neared the source of the light. She could make out two figures standing in the middle of the room, speaking in low tones. She stopped just outside the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the moment of truth. She had no idea what they were saying, but she could feel the weight of their words, the stakes high. She had to know. She had to hear it all. Slowly, she moved closer, her breath steady as she positioned herself just outside the door, straining to hear. What she heard next would change everything. She stood frozen outside the door, the faint hum of voices reaching her ears as her mind raced. The weight of the moment was suffocating. She had come this far, and now, the final test awaited her. The Mafia boss had trusted her with a mission, and now she had to see it through. Her grip tightened on the piece of paper that she had been given. The building around her was silent except for the voices she could barely make out. She moved closer to the door, pressing herself against the wall to avoid being seen, trying to listen in on the conversation that could make or break everything. From the voices, she could tell there were at least two people inside, and their tone was low, deliberate. She was close enough now to catch a few words, but not enough to understand everything they were saying. The conversation seemed tense, urgent. Her heart beat faster, each thump louder in her ears. She could hear the name of the boss being mentioned, and something about trust and loyalty. Her stomach dropped. The stakes were high, but she couldn't back out now. She had already taken the first step, and there was no going back. She took a deep breath and decided to take a risk. Moving swiftly, she slipped inside the room, hoping to go unnoticed. The moment she entered, the door creaked, and the two men inside immediately stopped talking. Her heart stopped in her chest. She had been caught. One of the men turned toward her, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. His face was hard, unyielding, but his gaze softened just slightly as he recognized her. The tension in the room was thick as the silence stretched between them. Finally, the man spoke. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, but she forced herself to speak. "I'm here to listen," she said, her voice steady despite the unease she felt. The man looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words, and then he nodded slowly, stepping aside to let her in. "If you're here, then you're already part of this, whether you know it or not," he said, his tone carrying a new edge. "But remember, loyalty is everything in this world." The other man didn't speak, his eyes only briefly flicking to her before turning back to the first. She could tell they were both sizing her up, just as Victor had done. This was another test, another moment that would determine her place in this dangerous world. She took a step forward, her mind focused on the task at hand. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice low but firm. "You're going to hear what you need to hear," the man said, his tone serious now. "But understand this, the boss doesn't tolerate betrayal. You're not just a witness. You're part of this now, and what happens next will affect you." She nodded, feeling the weight of his words press down on her. This was more than just an assignment. It was a moment that would define her future. She wasn't just delivering information now. She was involved in something bigger, something far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. The man turned to the other one, exchanging a brief look, and then both of them faced her. "Listen carefully," the first man said. "There's a decision that needs to be made, one that could change everything. And you're going to be the one to carry the message." She nodded again, though she still wasn't sure what he meant. But she had to trust him, just as she had trusted Victor and the boss. "What do I need to do?" she asked, her voice steady but with an edge of urgency. "Go back to the boss," the man replied, his voice cold and calculating. "Tell him what you've learned. And whatever happens next, you need to be ready. There's no turning back after this." The room fell silent again, the weight of the conversation hanging in the air. She knew what this meant. She was no longer just a pawn in the game. She was part of the decision-making process, a key player in the unfolding events. But with that came a responsibility she wasn't sure she was ready for. As she turned to leave, the man's voice stopped her. "Don't forget what you've heard here," he said. "The boss will expect results, and there's no place for failure." She nodded one last time and walked toward the door, the feeling of uncertainty still gnawing at her. But as she stepped outside into the cold night air, she felt something shift inside her. She had started out as the invisible maid, the one who cleaned and served without a second thought. But now, she was part of something much bigger. The world she had stepped into was dangerous, unpredictable, but it was also where she belonged. She had a role to play now, and she couldn't afford to fail. As she walked through the dark streets, her mind raced with what she had learned. There was no turning back, no way to undo the choices she had made. But one thing was clear, she had crossed the line, and now she was part of this world for better or worse. Her future was uncertain, but for the first time, she felt like she had the power to shape it. She had made it this far, and there was no turning back now. This gripping story takes you into a world where danger and loyalty collide in unexpected ways, with a strong focus on the complex dynamics of trust and power. A woman, once invisible in the shadows of a powerful mafia family, finds herself thrust into a series of life-changing decisions that could either make or break her. As the stakes rise, she becomes entangled in a web of suspense and deception, proving that loyalty comes at a steep price. Set against the backdrop of an underworld filled with crime and intrigue, this story offers a glimpse into a world where loyalty, betrayal, and power constantly shift. The romantic tension, built on mutual respect and unexpected trust, adds a unique layer to the story, showing that even in the darkest of circumstances, connections can form. This tale is not just about survival. It's about understanding the true meaning of trust and how it shapes relationships. These themes, central to the plot, mirror those found in many compelling romance stories, where love and loyalty are tested by harsh realities. The woman's journey is one of self-discovery, as she navigates the dangerous waters of a world she's never known. Amid the shadows and danger, she begins to realize that her true power lies not in what she can control, but in the relationships she builds and the trust she earns. Romance stories often explore these themes of transformation, where characters grow and evolve through their experiences. As the woman steps further into the world of power and influence, she is faced with choices that will define her future and possibly change the lives of those around her. Each decision she makes is intertwined with the complex relationships she forms, proving that even in the most perilous situations, there's always room for human connection. Her story, deeply rooted in the challenges of trust and love, resonates with the very essence of romance stories, where every action can lead to a new chapter of unexpected possibilities.